For a while now, I've been pondering. You know, I ponder lots of things, but there's a part of me that's been thinking about what would the world look like? What would humanity look like if we were to heed the prophetic warnings, these ancient warnings, exhortations that we've been given? What would happen if we were to be encouraged by them, to really work hard towards living by them? One writer says there's a time to live, there's a time to die, there's a time for everything. And another writer talks about you've camped at this mountain for long enough, you've gone around and around this mountain. It's time to stop going around the mountain. Up sticks, move the camp. Jesus says that we should recognize the times and the seasons, but we should know God's will. In the book of Revelation, in particular, I think in other prophetic books as well, but in Revelation there's this, God speaks about a world inhabited by humans and God, in which there's no more war, there's no more famine, there's no more suffering, no more tears. None of this stuff exists. I'm in my mid-50s. Like many of you, you will be old enough to remember the 1980s, the early 80s, and we were bopping away to Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Two Tribes Go to War. And round and about that time, there was all sorts of... I remember somebody coming into the school and sort of prepping us with regards to what should happen in the event of a nuclear war 40 years ago or thereabouts. 40 years earlier, so the 1940s, you've got another war going on that engulfed most of the world. And then I started thinking about my dad. My dad used to follow commodities prices, and there were charts all over his office wall. And a lot of these charts related to cycles. And in particular, Dad followed the work of a chap called W.D. Gann. But the point I'm making here is cycles. Revelation is saying you can live in a world where these war cycles, these famines of boom and these cycles of boom and bust, these cycles of plenty and famine. He's saying that we can live in a world where these cycles cease to, I don't know whether they cease, I'm just going to say cease to exist, certainly cease to influence us. In a sense, we stop going around this same old mountain of boom, bust, war, peace, blah, la, 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 la. And I thought, of course, we're to recognize the times and the seasons, but we're to know God's will. God's will is an unchanging will, because God is unchanging. And so the idea of being born again is to be an overcomer, is to be filled with the life of God, who exists before all things, and through whom all things exist. So we're no longer, I think one of the things Jesus is trying to teach us is that we can live a life where we are no longer victims of these cycles. And I've been thinking about this recently, as you can tell, and I thought about these economic cycles. Well, there are war cycles as well. So my father was looking for patterns, or following students of looking for patterns. And all of a sudden, I became more aware that there are events that happen in the universe, the planets. I don't know whether it's cosmological events, I'm not sure of the right word to use. But we all know that planets are orbiting and they align differently because they orbit differently. And when these things align, so we have solstices, don't we? And all of these other, when the sun covers the moon and the moon covers the sun and all sorts of things. And these, and solar flares and storms up, different planets have different sort of, I'm just going to sort of speak loosely here, weather patterns, and all of these events release energy to some degree or other, which has to disperse. And we, the human being, to some degree or other, are sensitive to these events that are occurring because of planetary changes, subtle changes in gravitational fields and electromagnetic fields and all sorts of weird and wonderful things. But these things have a subtle influence upon human beings. And so we appear to be whimsical. We appear to be out of control, but actually we're simply responding to events that are occurring a long, long way away, which might be changing the air pressure around us, or, our hormonal balance, or anything. But we respond to these things. And so we have these times and seasons. We have these events that occur. And science now is getting to the point where it can measure these events, solar flares, storms, such like. We're getting really good at measuring things. And so we're beginning to realize scientifically how these cosmological events influence us, how they impact the times, the seasons, the war cycle, the famine cycle, the plenty cycle, all of these cycles. And yet there we are in the book of Revelation. No more war, no more famine, no more lack. God wants us to live above the influence of these events that cause these seasons, that cause changes within a person that makes them war, changes in, the nature of things that cause the weather to change. Times and seasons, you see. All of this stuff going on out there that the mass majority of us are ignorant of. And yet there it is. Moses is saying, you've camped around this mountain, you've gone around this mountain for long enough, it's time to move on. Jesus is saying, recognize the times and the seasons, but know my will. And then in Revelation, he's saying, we can live when, in this new heavens, this new earth, this new human being. None of these were no longer victims, if you like, to these seasons, times, cycles. All of that stuff in the cosmos might still occur, but because we know it's occurring, and because we know God's will, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself, love your enemy, we somehow rise above these events, so those prophetic promises, exhortations in Revelation become a reality. You see, the universe can do whatever it likes in terms of wind and storms and solar flares. And we can recognize those times and seasons, measure them, even predict them today. So there's no need for us to respond to them negatively. Our response is to know God's will, and God's will is to love, 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 love. Because if you're loving, you ain't killing. If you're loving, you're not threatening to nuke your neighbor. If you're loving, there's no famine, because if you've got plenty, you're sharing with those who haven't. I'm having a bit of a time of it at the moment, but apparently, depending on who you read, this too can be as a result of what's going on in the cosmos. Because we don't realize just how sensitive we are to these changes. While somebody's rioting in the streets, other people are having some sort of spiritual epiphany. And so what matters is that those who, in this day and age, I think the phrase is, are waking up, for those people who are wanting peace and joy and love and righteousness to rule and reign, for those that are wanting people to overcome these seeming, they look like desires to war. But actually, what if they're not? What if there's more to it than being a desire? What if we're responding unknowingly to influences that we can't, feel, sense? You can feel the warmth, can't you? When you walk into a warm room out of a cold one, you can sense that. But we're talking about changes that are so subtle, but are having a profound influence upon a species that is told it is created in the image and likeness of God. So all of these things that are happening in the cosmos are part of creation. And if we are made in the image and likeness of the Creator, then I'll put my money on the fact that God isn't being influenced by these solar flares and sort of storms and planetary alignments. Because all of that stuff is made by Him. All of that stuff, in a sense, is, well, not in a sense, it is His. So we can choose, in a sense, either to be victims of these times and seasons, or we can choose to know God's will, which is to love, 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 and be overcomers. We can conquer these things, or in a sense, conquer ourselves. We just become disciplined. We become like God. God is love, and He is unchanging. So we've got to imagine a species, a human species, that simply doesn't respond to there's a time for this and there's a time for that, as it's written in Ecclesiastes. We become this unchanging, unswerving creature that love, 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 generous, peaceful, joy. We do what's right, regardless of the weather, locally or cosmologically. And we can only do what's right. We can only love rightly. We can only be at peace if we all know that it's possible to live like that. And it's God who makes that possible a reality. That's what Jesus achieved for us. Because Paul had this amazing revelation that, in a sense, God comes to live within us. He enables us to be overcomers, to be victorious, to live a life of deliberation. Is that right? Of deliberateness. We're no longer whimsical. We're not tossed this way and that. We're not hurrying to the left or the right. These cycles may carry on to exist, but we don't have to respond to them in the manner that we do unknowingly. Now that we're able to measure these things, we know they're going to happen. There's that proverb, isn't there? People perish for a lack of knowledge. There's no need for us to perish. We know that these things exist scientifically. This is proven. So what we know empowers us. So we're no longer, well, we don't have to be. We can choose to do nothing about it. The knowledge that we have, if we do nothing with it, then we'll simply remain victims. And the war cycle, the famine cycle, and all the rest of these cycles will continue to exist. But if we do something with our knowledge, then we're not going to perish. We can prepare because we can measure. We can have this revelation promise where we've heeded these prophetic exhortations, recognize the times and seasons, but know God's will. And His will is that we live above these things. They might still happen. They might cease to happen. Perhaps if we all live at peace, perhaps the universe, perhaps the cosmos will take note of the sort of eyebrows and the, because I'm going out on a limb here. But perhaps if we can receive these tiny, vibrations or whatever they might be, if we're receivers, perhaps we can be transmitters too. So that's where I was going with that thought. If we recognize these times and seasons, these events that are happening, and if in our ignorance we've been receiving something as a result of their occurring, which means we go to war every 40 years or whatever it might be, what happens if the receiver becomes a transmitter? What happens if we go from being victims of times and seasons to knowing God's will? What happens if humanity says we're not going to respond to these times and seasons anymore? What happens if humanity suddenly says we're going to know God's will, and God's will is that we love, 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 love. We live in peace. We do what's right. Perhaps something outside of us would respond. If we transmit differently. Because I suppose if we receive as a victim of a time and a season, as a cycle, if what we receive causes us to go to war, then we've transmitted something, haven't we, that's caused us to go to war with somebody else. So, in a sense, if we know about the things that might cause us to perish, to endure war, famine, or whatever it might be, and because we've prepared, we can live in a very, very different way. So we can stop going around this cyclical mountain, I think in the scriptures it even says there's a season for war. Was it the spring of the year or something? Ancient people knew something too, and we now have the scientific means of measuring some of the things that they kind of knew. But we have the same, whether you know it scientifically or whether you know it through a different means, you've still got the same choice to make. And that choice is very simple. Given that we recognize these things, we know these times and seasons, we can choose to live differently, can't we? We can choose to know God's will, and in doing so we can choose to live as God wills. And in doing so we begin to reflect more of his image and likeness.